For the database I'm building here, I started out by creating a table of books. As you'll recall, to begin with, it was set up as a very basic list, with several fields in a table to store some key facts about each book. The title, the author, the publisher, and so on. Later on, after I'd entered some data on a few books, I pointed out that the data on publishers was being duplicated. That is, the same information had to be entered on more than one record. Not a good idea, especially if there may eventually be a lot of books entered, with lots of them coming from the same few publishers. Much better to enter the detail on each publisher only once, and then just reference it on each of the relevant book records. What that process points to is the fact that my original list of books was really, ideally, at least two separate lists, one of books and one of publishers, with a connection linking each book to a publishing house. Or if you look at it the other way around, linking each publisher record to all of the books for that publisher. So now the database has two separate tables and is tracking two different kinds of information. Information about books and information about publishers. And it's also tracking the relationships between them. This is what makes it a relational database. It has more than one layer in the form of its two tables, so it's no longer what's sometimes called a flat file database. Now if we stop to look for a moment, it's easy to see that what's going on here is only part of the solution. Just as publishers are separate things or entities from the books they publish, so are authors. An author may have written or co-written many of the books in our list, so it really makes no more sense to have author details repeated endlessly, entered again for every book they're associated with. Just as with publishers, it makes sense to put authors into their own separate table and just reference them from the records for each book they've written. Another reason that this makes sense is while an author may be the sole creator of one book, they may be a joint creator of another. It's not uncommon for a book to have co-authors, or an author, an editor, an illustrator, and so on. So we need to allow for both the possibility that a book may have multiple authors, and also that an author may have been involved in different ways with multiple books. We'll need to take account of that in the data design. To get started on working out a suitable structure for a given database, there are a few things that it makes sense to do at the outset. First of all, it's important to get a clear picture of how many different kinds of entities the database will keep track of. By entities, I mean things that have their own separate existence, in the way that authors, books, and publishers exist separately. It's generally a good idea to put each kind of entity into its own table in the data structure. As well as keeping track of things that have an independent existence, it's sometimes also necessary to store information about the connections between entities. One good example of this is where students are admitted to a class. There are obviously at least two types of entities here, the students and the class or classes they'll attend. However, you would probably want to create an enrolment record to document the association between student and class. So in a sense, the enrolment itself becomes a third entity to keep track of. Coming back to the database I'm building here, before I go much further, I'll need a clear picture of what all the underlying entities are, so I can use it as a guide to the data structure I'll need to create. To do that, I'll first write a list of the entities to be tracked, and I'm going to use a separate program, a text editor, to write my list. Now, I've already worked out that I need to keep track of books, publishers, and authors. But when I think about it, books is probably too narrow a description, because I might want to include articles, films, and other reference material. So now's a good time to rethink the category a little, and it would make sense if the books table were instead called a publications table. So far so good. However, I know that I'll also want to keep track of quotations taken from various books, and the assignments or projects where the quotations are used. So that's two more tables right there. Now, when I'm thinking about the relationships between these five entities, there are a couple of them that may be a little more complex than the rest. First of all, as I mentioned, there could be several dimensions to the connection between authors and publications, and I'll need a place to record the different kinds of involvement an author has in each different publication. That is, the same individual may have written one book but edited another. So it will be helpful to have a separate place where we keep track of the kind of involvement each author has with each publication their name appears on. Let's call that the author publication join table. Similarly, each quotation might be used in several different assignments, and each assignment is likely to include multiple quotations. And with that, a quotation might be used in different ways in different assignments, which is something it might be good to be able to keep track of. So an assignment quotation join table is also a good idea. At this point, the outline of the structure is looking pretty good, I think. There may be a few housekeeping things to keep track of as the database is working, and it would be good to keep them separate from the data structure I've outlined so far. So I'm going to include a system table for the database itself to use. And it will also probably be necessary to keep notes about various things in the system, so an all-purpose notes table could be a good addition. Now that I've got a fairly complete list of all the things that will need to be tracked in the database, the next step is to build it. So coming up next, we'll take a look at the process of using FileMaker Pro to build a database structure along the lines of what I've mapped out here.